Welcome back to Mildly Interesting and Sleepy. Settle in. The world outside is quiet at this hour, and that quietness is good because what we are going to think about tonight benefits from quiet. It is the kind of thinking that needs space around it, room to breathe, room to be surprising and a little strange. Tonight we are spending time with Plato. Born in Athens around 428 before the Common Era, from one of the most distinguished aristocratic families in the city, who was perhaps 20 years old when he encountered Socrates, and who was so transformed by that encounter that he gave up his plans for a political career and devoted the rest of his 80 years to philosophy. Plato was not only a philosopher, he was also, by the testimony of his own time and of every subsequent era that has read him, a great literary artist. The dialogues he wrote are philosophical conversations in dramatic form, and they were recognized in antiquity as literary masterpieces even by people who disagreed with every philosophical position they contained. He also had the most influential idea in the history of philosophy, the theory of forms, the conviction that behind the world we perceive with our senses there is another world, more real, unchanging, eternal, accessible only to reason. This idea shaped Western philosophy, Western theology, and Western art for 2,000 years. It is probably wrong, in the strict sense that most philosophers today would not defend it as Plato stated it. It is also one of those ideas that, even when you reject it, makes you think more carefully about what you believe instead, which is a sign of a very powerful idea. Let us begin with who Plato was before philosophy became everything. The young Plato, lineage, ambition, and the encounter that changed everything. Plato's real name was almost certainly Aristocles. The nickname Plato, from the Greek word platus meaning broad or wide, was given to him in youth, perhaps for his broad shoulders, perhaps for the breadth of his literary style. He came from extraordinary aristocratic lineage on both sides. His father Ariston traced his descent from the early kings of Athens, a genealogy that in the Athenian context carried genuine social and political weight. His mother Perictian was connected to the family of the great lawgiver Solon, one of the founders of Athenian civic life. This was not merely comfortable aristocracy. It was the highest social tier of one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world. Growing up in late 5th century Athens with this background, the natural path was politics. Athens was a democracy in which influence and power came through the ability to speak persuasively in the assembly, to build coalitions of family connections and political allies, to navigate the complex web of competing factions and competing interests that constituted Athenian public life. A young man of Plato's intelligence and lineage could reasonably have expected to reach the highest levels of public affairs. His family certainly expected this. He was educated accordingly, in music and gymnastics and rhetoric, and everything an aristocratic Athenian young man needed to know to participate in civic life. There are stories that he burned his early poems after meeting Socrates, that he had been working on a tragedy for the theatrical competitions and abandoned it, that he turned away from everything he had been planning and gave himself entirely to philosophy. Whether or not these stories are accurate in their particulars, the direction of change is not disputed. Plato spent 20 years in the Socratic circle until Socrates' death in 399. And then came the political catastrophes that made politics, for Plato, not merely unappealing but morally impossible. The 30 tyrants, the brutal oligarchic regime installed by Sparta after Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War, were connected to Plato's family. Critias, one of the most violent and ambitious of the 30, was his mother's cousin. The 30 invited Plato to participate in the new government, appealing to his aristocratic connections and to his evident intelligence. He felt initial sympathy for their stated goal of reforming Athenian politics. Then he watched them govern: mass executions, confiscation of property, the casual destruction of people who got in their way. His sympathy dissolved completely. When the democracy was restored, he felt hope again that justice would be done and good governance established. Then the restored democracy tried and executed Socrates, the wisest and most just person Plato had ever known. Through a legal process he was present to witness. He wrote later, in the 7th letter, that after this he felt unable to find any existing political system that was not thoroughly corrupt, and that the only remedy was philosophical. Either philosophers would have to become rulers, or rulers would have to become philosophers. This conviction, arrived at through painful personal experience rather than abstract reasoning, drove the most interesting and most disastrous episodes of Plato's mature life. Traveling and founding, Sicily, the Academy, and the philosopher-king experiment. After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens and traveled for several years. He went to Megara, where Euclid of Megara had gathered other Socratic followers, continuing the work of philosophical inquiry. He probably went to Cyrene in North Africa, where he encountered significant mathematical work being done in the Pythagorean tradition that would influence his own philosophy. He may have gone to Egypt. In approximately 388 or 387, he went to Sicily, and this visit began a long and complicated relationship with the island that would occupy crucial chapters of the rest of his life. At the court of Dionysius I, the powerful tyrant of Syracuse, Plato met a man named Dion, Dionysius's brother-in-law, who was philosophically inclined and idealistic, and who became one of the most significant relationships of Plato's life. Dion was captivated by Plato's ideas about how a city should be governed and what a just ruler would look like, and he believed that with the right philosophical education, political power could be made to serve genuine human good. Plato found in Dion a man who seemed to take philosophy with the seriousness it deserved, applied to the domain where Plato most wanted it to apply. The first visit to Sicily ended badly. Dionysius I was not interested in philosophical education, found Plato's conversations irritating or threatening, and according to some ancient sources, had Plato sold into slavery from which he was ransomed by friends. The details are contested, but what is not contested is that Plato returned to Athens without accomplishing anything in Sicily and having been in genuine personal danger. Back in Athens, around 387, he founded the Academy. The institution was located in a park outside the city walls, a grove of olive trees sacred to the hero Academus, and its name derived from this location. The Academy was the first institution in Western history that we can recognize as a university, a place where sustained inquiry into philosophy and mathematics and related subjects was conducted, where students came from across the Greek world to study for extended periods, and where the institution had a continuous life independent of any single teacher. It lasted, with various changes of leadership and direction, for nearly 900 years, until the Christian Emperor Justinian closed it in 529 as a pagan institution. Among its students would eventually be Aristotle, who spent 20 years there and whose response to what he learned forms one of the great intellectual dialogues in history. The second visit to Sicily came in 367, after Dionysius I had died, and his son Dionysius II had come to power. Dion believed, passionately and perhaps misguidedly, that the new Dionysius was genuinely open to philosophical formation and might become the philosopher-king that Plato had theorized in the Republic. Plato went, against his better judgment, because the possibility of philosophy actually shaping political power was too important to dismiss without trying. The visit was another disappointment. Dionysius II wanted the prestige of having the most famous philosopher in the Greek world at his court and wanted to demonstrate his own philosophical sophistication, but he did not want to be genuinely reformed by philosophical education. Dion was exiled for political reasons. Plato found himself in a delicate position and eventually managed to leave. A third visit in 361 accomplished even less. Plato went at Dionysius's insistence, hoping at minimum to secure better treatment for Dion. He returned home having done nothing useful and feeling, he wrote in the seventh letter, old and weary. Dion eventually returned to Syracuse by force, briefly took power, tried to govern on philosophical principles, and was assassinated by a man who had been part of the Platonic circle. The whole Sicilian adventure was a sustained and painful exercise in the gap between philosophical ideal and political reality. Plato wrote about it honestly in the seventh letter, if that letter is genuine, which scholars debate. He reflected on the experience without either self-justification or self-flagellation, acknowledging what had not worked and why, maintaining that the attempt had been worth making even though it had failed. This intellectual honesty about failure is one of the more humanly attractive aspects of Plato's character, as it appears in the historical record. The theory of forms, the most influential idea in philosophy. The theory of forms is the idea most associated with Plato, and it is one of those ideas that is at once simple to state and genuinely difficult to understand, that becomes more demanding and more strange the more carefully you examine it. The basic claim, the particular things we experience with our senses, this beautiful painting, that just act, these two apparently equal lengths of rope, are not the most fundamental realities. They are imperfect, temporary, changing instances or reflections of perfect, unchanging, eternal, non-physical realities that Plato calls forms, sometimes translated as ideas. The form of beauty is not a beautiful thing in the world. It is beauty itself, perfect and eternal, of which all beautiful things in the world are imperfect and temporary reflections. The form of justice is not any particular just act or arrangement. It is justice itself, of which all just things in the world are approximate expressions. The form of equality is not any pair of equal things. It is equality itself, the standard by reference to which we judge whether things are equal. These forms exist in a realm entirely separate from the physical world. They do not change. They do not deteriorate with time. They do not depend on anyone's perception or thought. A beautiful face becomes less beautiful with age and eventually dies. The form of beauty does not age and cannot die. A just law may be repealed or corrupted. The form of justice is uncorruptible. In Plato's metaphysical picture, the forms are more real than physical things, not less real, and the philosopher's task is to turn attention away from the shadows and appearances of physical existence toward the genuine reality of the forms. The theory emerged from several converging sources in Plato's philosophical environment. Mathematics was the most important. Plato was deeply influenced by the Pythagorean tradition, which had placed mathematics at the center of its understanding of reality. When a mathematician thinks about the number 5, or about the properties of a perfect circle, or about the relationship expressed in the Pythagorean theorem, they are not thinking about any particular physical collection of 5 things or any particular drawn circle on a piece of papyrus. The drawn circle is only approximately circular. The mathematical circle is perfectly circular, and this perfection is not a physical property, but a formal or abstract one. Mathematical truths are universal, necessary, and eternal. The Pythagorean theorem was true before anyone proved it, would have been true if no one had ever proved it, and will be true regardless of whether the physical universe continues to exist. Plato generalized this. The same kind of abstract, universal, necessary reality that mathematical objects have is shared by all the concepts that matter most: justice and beauty and goodness and equality and being itself. Another source was Socrates' method of definition. When Socrates asked what is courage or what is justice, he was assuming that there was something courage really was, a genuine and stable nature that all courageous acts shared by virtue of which they were courageous. Plato asked where this nature resided. It could not be in any particular courageous act, because particular acts were particular, located in time and space, and the nature of courage was universal, applicable to acts in any time or place. It must reside in something universal and non-physical. It must reside in the form of courage. The most famous and most beautiful presentation of the theory of forms is the Allegory of the Cave in the 7th book of the Republic. Socrates asks his interlocutor Glaucon to imagine prisoners who have been chained in an underground cave since birth, facing a wall. Behind the prisoners, unseen by them, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, unseen puppeteers carry objects past the fire, casting shadows of those objects on the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners have seen nothing but these shadows their entire lives. They name the shadows, predict their sequences, develop expertise in the patterns of shadow play. The shadows are their reality. Now imagine one prisoner is freed and turned to face the fire. He is confused and dazzled. The fire is much brighter than the shadows, and the real objects are more complex and less easily understood than their shadows. He is dragged out of the cave into daylight. He can see nothing at first. The light is overwhelming. Gradually, painfully, over time, his eyes adjust. He can see shadows of objects in the real world, then reflections in pools of water, then the objects themselves, then the stars at night, then the moon, and finally, painfully and slowly, the sun itself, which is the source of all the light by which everything else is visible and known. He realizes that what he and the other prisoners took to be reality was shadow, that the real world is this world of sunlight and solid objects, and that the sun is the ultimate source of everything. And then the allegory asks its political question. What should he do? He could stay in the sunlight, which is more pleasant and more true than the cave, or he could return to the cave to try to free the others. If he returns, his eyes, adjusted to sunlight, will see the shadows poorly. He will be at a disadvantage compared to the prisoners who have never left. They may laugh at him and resist his attempts to free them, and perhaps kill him if he tries too hard. But the freed prisoner who has seen the sun has an obligation that the pleasures of sunlight do not cancel. The allegory maps the theory of forms onto a narrative about education and politics. The shadows are the world of appearance, what we perceive through the senses. The objects in sunlight are the forms, the genuine realities. The sun is the form of the good, the ultimate reality that is the source of all other reality and all knowability. The philosopher is the freed prisoner, and the philosophical life is the ascent from shadow to sunlight, from appearance to reality, from opinion to genuine knowledge. The theory has been criticized from Aristotle onward with considerable sophistication. The third man argument, the problem of participation, the problem of how the forms and the physical world are related, the problem of how human minds have access to a non-physical realm. These are genuine difficulties that no one has fully resolved within a Platonic framework. Most philosophers today would not defend the theory of forms as Plato stated it. But the questions it raises about the nature of universals, about the relationship between abstract and physical reality, about how we have knowledge of necessary truths, These questions remain live and important in contemporary philosophy of mathematics, metaphysics, and epistemology. The theory is wrong in the way that powerful, generative ideas are often wrong, not by being simply mistaken, but by being approximately right in ways that illuminate what the correct answer must look like. Recollection, the immortal soul, and learning as remembering. The theory of forms creates an immediate epistemological problem. If the forms are non-physical and exist in a realm entirely separate from the physical world we perceive, how do human beings come to know them? We cannot perceive them with our senses. We do not find them through empirical investigation of the physical world, and yet we do seem to have access to them. We can do mathematics. We can recognize when something is just or beautiful. We can grasp universal and necessary truths. Where does this knowledge come from? Plato's answer is the theory of recollection, and it comes packaged with a specific and remarkable claim about the soul. The soul is immortal and pre-exists the body. Before birth, the soul exists in the realm of the forms and has direct acquaintance with them. At birth, the soul is united with a body and forgets its prior knowledge, though the knowledge is not entirely destroyed, but only latent, available to be recalled under the right conditions. Learning, on this account, is not the acquisition of genuinely new knowledge from outside, but the recollection of what the soul already knew from its existence before birth. This is why the Socratic method works as Plato understands it. The teacher does not pour knowledge into an empty vessel, but creates the conditions for the student to recall what their soul already knows. The midwife metaphor that Socrates used for his own philosophical practice is exactly right on the Platonic interpretation. The midwife does not create the child, but helps bring to birth what is already present. The philosophical teacher does not create understanding, but helps the student access the understanding their soul already possesses. The most famous demonstration of recollection is in the Meno, where Socrates takes an uneducated slave boy, a person who has received no mathematical education, and through careful questioning alone, without teaching, leads him to arrive at the correct solution to a geometrical problem: how to double the area of a square. The boy has not been taught this. He has been asked questions that led him to work it out. Where did the knowledge come from? Not from experience in this life. Therefore, Plato argues, it must have come from a prior existence. The soul knew geometry before this incarnation, and the questioning released that knowledge from latency into conscious awareness. The arguments for the soul's immortality after death, as well as before birth, are developed at length in the Phaedo, the dialogue that takes place on the last day of Socrates' life. Several arguments are offered. Opposites generate each other in a cycle. Sleeping generates waking, waking generates sleeping, living generates dying, dying generates living. The living come from the dead. Therefore, the dead must persist somewhere to generate the living, and the souls of the dead must continue existing to be reborn. The soul is akin to the forms, simple, invisible, unchanging, immortal. The body is akin to physical things, composite, visible, changing, mortal. Since the soul is more like the immortal things, it is more likely to be immortal. The soul is the principle of life. It cannot admit its opposite, death, any more than fire can admit its opposite, cold, while remaining fire. Therefore, the soul is deathless. These arguments have been examined and contested ever since. The Phaedo presents the objections alongside the arguments. Simmias objects that the soul might be like the tuning of a lyre, a harmony that depends on the physical instrument and ceases when the instrument is destroyed. Cebes objects that even if the soul outlasts one body, it might be worn down through successive incarnations and eventually perish. Socrates addresses both objections, but whether the responses are fully satisfying has been debated ever since. The aspiration behind the arguments is as important as the arguments themselves. Plato was insisting that the soul was more fundamental and more lasting than the body, that what we are most essentially is not our physical organism, but our rational and moral center, and that the philosopher who has spent life attending to the soul, who has practiced detachment from the body's pleasures and pains, who has lived as far as possible in the intellectual mode of engagement with the forms, is naturally better prepared for whatever follows the body's death. Philosophy, on this account, is not merely a theoretical enterprise. It is a way of living, a practice, a preparation. The Republic, justice, the soul, and the architecture of the ideal. The Republic is the longest and most ambitious of the Platonic dialogues, running to more than 300 pages in modern editions, and it is one of those works that is impossible to summarize without distorting, because it operates at so many levels simultaneously. It is a political theory, but it is also a theory of the soul. It is a theory of education, but it is also a theory of knowledge. It is a sustained meditation on justice, but it is also an account of why justice is worth pursuing, even when injustice would bring greater material advantage. It is, in short, Plato's attempt to put his whole philosophical vision into a single sustained argument, and its ambition is matched by its difficulty. The conversation begins with the question of what justice is, and whether it is ever in a person's interest to be just rather than unjust. The most challenging position is put forward by Thrasymachus, a sophist who argues that justice is simply whatever serves the interests of the stronger, that it is a convenient fiction maintained by the powerful to keep the less powerful from taking what they could take. Even more challenging are the positions developed by Glaucon and Adeimantus, Plato's older brothers, who argue that most people are just only because they fear punishment or social disapproval, and ask Socrates to show them that justice is worth choosing even when the unjust person could be sure of escaping all external consequences. To answer this challenge, Socrates proposes building an ideal city in words, because justice, he says, will be easier to see in the larger letters of the city than in the smaller letters of the individual soul. The city and the soul are structurally analogous. Understanding one illuminates the other. The just city is divided into three classes: the producers, the craftsmen and farmers and merchants who do the material work of maintaining the city's life, correspond to the appetitive part of the soul, the part that seeks material satisfaction. The guardians, the military class who defend the city against external enemies and internal disorder, correspond to the spirited part of the soul, the part that seeks honor and responds to the call of courage and dignity. The philosopher rulers, those rare individuals who have completed the full philosophical education and alone have genuine knowledge rather than mere opinion, correspond to the rational part of the soul, the part that seeks truth and wisdom. Justice in the city is each class doing its proper work, producers producing, guardians defending, philosopher rulers governing. No class encroaches on the function of another. No one attempts to do the work for which they have neither the natural aptitude nor the training. Justice in the individual soul is the same structure, reason governing, with spirit as its necessary ally, and appetite kept in its proper subordinate position. The unjust soul, by contrast, is one in which appetite has seized control, in which the pursuit of pleasure or money or power has displaced reason from its proper governing role. This answer to the original challenge is subtle. Plato is not saying that justice pays better than injustice in terms of external rewards. He is saying that the just person has a better, healthier, more harmonious internal life than the unjust person, regardless of external circumstances. The tyrant, who appears to have everything and is subject to no external constraint, is actually the most unfree and most wretched person, because the tyrant's soul is ruled by appetite, is driven by insatiable desires that can never be satisfied, is incapable of the internal harmony that constitutes genuine well-being. The philosopher, who has very little in material terms but whose soul is ordered by reason, is genuinely flourishing. Justice is worth choosing because it is constitutive of the best human life, not merely instrumentally useful for getting external goods. The education of the philosopher rulers is one of the most developed and most contested aspects of the Republic. They are first educated through music and gymnastics, music to shape the soul's emotional dispositions, gymnastics to shape the body without making bodily strength an end in itself. Then they study mathematics, arithmetic, plane geometry, solid geometry, astronomy understood as the study of mathematical regularities in the movements of heavenly bodies, and harmonics understood as the mathematical study of musical ratios. Mathematics trains the mind to move from the changing and particular things perceived by the senses to the unchanging and universal objects of pure intellect. It is the intellectual preparation for philosophy. Only after decades of this mathematical preparation are the potential philosopher rulers introduced to philosophical dialectic, the direct examination of the forms through pure rational argument, ascending without the aid of physical images or unexamined hypotheses to the form of the good itself. The philosopher rulers do not want to rule. Having spent their lives ascending toward the sunlight of the forms, they would prefer to remain in contemplation of what is most real and most beautiful. But justice requires that they return to the cave. Those who have seen the good have an obligation to use that knowledge for the benefit of those who have not. The philosopher-king, if that formula must be used, is not a person who seeks power, but a person who reluctantly accepts the responsibilities that knowledge creates. The Republic's most controversial proposals are well known. The guardians and philosopher rulers are to hold all things in common, including children. There will be no private families among the ruling classes, because attachment to one's own family creates particular loyalties that conflict with impartial concern for the whole community. Women of sufficient natural ability will receive the same education and the same opportunities as men, including governance. Plato was remarkable among ancient thinkers for this position, which was genuinely radical in its social context. And certain kinds of poetry and music are to be excluded from the city because they strengthen the emotional parts of the soul at the expense of reason. Whether the ideal city is a political program that Plato actually hoped to implement, or a thought experiment designed to illuminate the structure of justice by showing it writ large, or something else entirely, is a question scholars have not settled. The Sicilian Adventures suggest that Plato genuinely believed philosophical education could shape political reality. The seventh letter suggests he recognized how difficult this was and how rarely it would be possible. Karl Popper's attack on Plato in the Open Society and its enemies treats the Republic as the blueprint for totalitarianism and argues that Plato is the original enemy of liberal democracy. Others argue that this misreads both the Republic and the Socratic method as a form of open inquiry that contradicts authoritarian imposition. The argument continues. Love and the Ladder, the Symposium. The Symposium stands in productive contrast to the Republic, where the Republic is systematic and ambitious and not infrequently austere. The Symposium is warm and funny and dramatically alive, a masterpiece of Plato's literary art as well as a profound piece of philosophy. It is a dialogue about love, and it is itself an act of love, a sustained tribute to Socrates that is also an exploration of what love ultimately is and what it is for. The setting is a dinner party at the house of the playwright Agathon, who has just won a prize at the dramatic festivals of 416. The guests, who include Socrates, Aristophanes, the physician Eryximachus, the young Phaedrus, and eventually Alcibiades, arriving dramatically drunk, decide to spend the evening giving speeches in praise of Eros, the god of erotic love. Each speech is colored by the personality and profession of its speaker. Phaedrus speaks of love as the most ancient of the gods and the source of the greatest human goods, particularly the courage that lovers display for the sake of the beloved. Pausanias distinguishes common love, directed at bodies, from heavenly love, directed at souls and wisdom. Eryximachus, speaking as a physician, expands love to a universal principle of harmony operating through all of nature and human culture, the force that brings opposites into proper balance. Aristophanes, speaking as a comic playwright, offers the most memorable of the non-philosophical speeches, a myth about how human beings were originally spherical double creatures, with 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 faces, who were split in 2 by Zeus for their arrogance, and who spend their lives searching for their other half. The speech is comic and moving, and captures something true about erotic love as a feeling of recognition, of finding what was missing, and it has resonated with readers for 2,500 years. Then Socrates speaks, and his speech, delivered as the report of what he learned from a wise woman named Diotima of Mantinea, is the philosophical center of the dialogue, and one of the most beautiful things Plato ever wrote. Diotima teaches that Eros is not himself beautiful or wise or divine, as the previous speakers had assumed, but is a great spirit, a daimon, in between the mortal and the divine. He is the son of poverty and resource. He has his mother's perpetual need and hunger, and his father's resourcefulness, ingenuity, and relentless energy. He is always seeking what he lacks: beauty, wisdom, the good. This is why he is a lover rather than a beloved, always reaching rather than ever resting in what is reached. Diotima then describes what she calls the ascent to beauty, the ladder of love, which is the philosophical account of what love is ultimately for and where it ultimately leads. A young person begins by falling in love with one beautiful body and learning to produce beautiful speech about that love. They are led to recognize that the beauty in this one body is akin to the beauty in all beautiful bodies, and so their love expands from one to all beautiful bodies, from particular to general. From the beauty of bodies, they ascend to recognize that the beauty of souls is more valuable and more lasting than the beauty of bodies, and their love rises further still. From the beauty of souls to the beauty of activities and practices and laws. From there to the beauty of the various branches of knowledge. And finally, if they are fortunate and if their guide is skilled, they arrive at a sudden and overwhelming vision of beauty itself, the form of beauty, which is always and eternally the same, which does not grow or diminish, which is not beautiful in one respect and ugly in another. Not beautiful to one observer and ugly to another, not beautiful at one time and faded at another, but simply, absolutely, eternally, unchangingly beautiful, the source of all the beauty in all the beautiful things they have loved along the way. This vision is the philosophical life's destination, and the person who has arrived there has achieved genuine knowledge rather than mere opinion, has understood what beauty really is rather than what any beautiful thing happens to be. And Diotima promises that this knowledge is more valuable than all the beautiful things that led to it put together. It is what they were all pointing toward, imperfectly and partially, without being able to fully contain it. Then Alcibiades arrives. He is drunk and wreathed with violets and ivy, and he immediately spots Socrates hiding behind Agathon, and he says, laughing, that Socrates is always turning up in the most unexpected places to ambush him. He delivers a speech not about Eros in general, but about Socrates specifically, comparing him to the little Silenus statues sold in the Agora, ridiculous and ugly on the outside, but opening to reveal golden divine figures inside. He describes how Socrates' words are the only things that have ever made him feel ashamed of the way he lives, that penetrate past all his defenses and his brilliance and his beauty and reach the real him, who knows he is not living as he should. He describes trying to seduce Socrates and being rebuffed with perfect composure, as though his famous beauty was simply not a relevant consideration. He says he cannot stop thinking about Socrates and cannot bring himself to live as Socrates makes him know he should live. The speech is a beautiful demonstration of the ladder of love from the other side. Alcibiades has perceived the divine beauty in Socrates and cannot handle what he has seen, cannot make the response that the perception demands. The divided line, a map of reality and knowledge. Between the allegory of the cave and the political argument of the Republic, there is another image, the divided line, which gives the most systematic and abstract picture Plato offers of the different levels of reality and the different cognitive states that correspond to them. It is less dramatic than the cave, but in some ways more precise. Imagine a line cut into two unequal sections. The lower, shorter section represents the visible realm, the world of physical things and their images. The upper, longer section represents the intelligible realm, the world of forms and mathematical objects. Each section is itself divided in the same proportion, yielding 4 subsections. The lowest subsection of the visible realm contains images, shadows, reflections in water, paintings, and other representations of physical things. The cognitive state corresponding to this level is imagination or illusion, eikasia in Greek. The person who relates to images as though they were real is in the most confused relation to reality available to a human being. The higher subsection of the visible realm contains actual physical objects, actual animals, actual artifacts, actual human beings. The cognitive state here is belief or opinion, pistis. We take physical things for reality, which is a significant improvement on taking images for reality, but still falls short of genuine knowledge. The lower subsection of the intelligible realm contains mathematical objects, numbers, geometrical figures, the abstract entities that mathematics reasons about. The mathematician thinks about these using hypotheses as starting points, without questioning the hypotheses, and uses visible diagrams as aids to thinking, even though the real objects of thought are abstract rather than drawn. The cognitive state here is thought or understanding, dianla, rigorous, systematic, genuinely about abstract objects, but still limited by its reliance on unexamined hypotheses and visible images. The highest subsection of the intelligible realm contains the forms themselves, approached through pure philosophical dialectic that makes no use of sensory aids and proceeds without unexamined assumptions all the way to the form of the good as the unhypothetical first principle. The cognitive state here is intelligence or direct understanding, gnosis, the philosopher in direct rational contact with genuine reality. The divided line is a map of a journey, from the appearance of physical things, through physical things themselves, through the abstract objects of mathematics, to the forms and ultimately the form of the good. And it is also a map of degrees of reality. The shadows in the cave are less real than the physical objects that cast them, which are less real than the forms that physical objects imperfectly instantiate, which are all dependent on the form of the good, which is their ultimate source. Reality comes in degrees, and so does knowledge. Art and the philosopher's paradox. One of the more counterintuitive features of Plato's thought is his sustained and serious suspicion of art, particularly poetry and dramatic performance, combined with the fact that he was himself one of the supreme literary artists of antiquity. The tension between these two facts is not accidental and not simply a contradiction. It points to something important about what Plato thought art was and what philosophy required. His philosophical objections to art operate at several levels. At the level of ontology, art imitates physical things, which are themselves imperfect imitations of the forms. The painter who paints a beautiful woman is imitating a physical woman who is herself an imperfect reflection of the form of beauty. The painting is therefore an imitation of an imitation, two steps removed from genuine reality. At the level of psychology, art speaks to the emotional and appetitive parts of the soul rather than to reason. Tragic drama produces pity and tears. Comedy produces laughter. Music inflames the passions. All of these strengthen the lower parts of the soul at the expense of the rational part. At the level of morality, traditional poetry depicts the gods behaving badly, expressing rage and jealousy and vindictiveness, and gives young people false models of what divine and human excellence looks like. The expulsion of the poets from the ideal city in the Republic is one of the most cited and most controversial passages in all of Plato. He does it with evident regret. He loves poetry, he says, and especially Homer, and if anyone can show him that poetry has a place in a well-ordered city, he will be glad to be persuaded. But he cannot yet find the argument. Until someone makes the case for poetry's value in rational and philosophical terms, poetry must go. And yet the dialogues themselves are masterpieces of literary art. The myths that Plato inserts at crucial moments, the myth of the myth of the charioteer, the myth of Atlantis, are poetry of a kind, using narrative and image and dramatic power to communicate what philosophical argument alone cannot convey. The symposium is a dramatic achievement of the highest order. The Phaedo is moving in ways that go beyond the philosophical arguments it contains. Plato clearly understood the power of image and narrative and dramatic form deeply enough to use them with extraordinary skill. The paradox, or the resolution of the paradox, may lie in Plato's understanding of what distinguishes philosophical myth from ordinary poetry. Philosophical myth is in service of truth. It uses narrative and image not to bypass reason, but to extend it, to gesture toward what discursive argument cannot fully reach, to orient the soul toward the forms rather than away from them. Ordinary poetry engages the emotions in ways that strengthen appetite and weaken reason. Philosophical poetry, if properly constructed, does the opposite. Whether this distinction ultimately holds, whether Plato's own myth-making falls on the right side of the line he draws, is a question readers have been debating ever since. The late dialogues, self-criticism and deepening. The dialogues Plato wrote in the last decades of his life are different in character from the middle works, and the differences reveal how seriously he continued to engage with the difficulties in his own positions, even when those difficulties were severe. The Parmenides is the most extreme case. In this dialogue, a very old and very distinguished Parmenides, the philosopher who had argued that all genuine reality was one and unchanging, subjects the theory of forms to a series of devastating logical objections in a conversation with the young Socrates who is defending the theory. The third man argument: if beautiful things require the form of beauty to explain their beauty, what explains the form of beauty's own beauty? Does this require another form? And another? The problem of participation. What exactly does it mean for a physical thing to participate in a form? How does the physical relate to the non-physical? Parmenides presses these objections with remorseless skill, and Socrates does not successfully answer them. Whether Plato thought he had answers that Socrates simply failed to deploy, or was genuinely showing the difficulties of the theory while still believing it was the best account available, or was moving toward a significant revision, is one of the most discussed questions in Plato's scholarship. What is clear is that Plato did not hide from the difficulties. He staged them dramatically, in the most unfavorable possible form for the theory, and left them unresolved. The Sophist and the Statesman are technical metaphysical works that seem to modify the theory of forms significantly, allowing for genuine relations between forms and between forms and the physical world, in ways that the earlier presentation had made difficult. The Timaeus gives a detailed account of the creation of the physical world by a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who imposes order on formless matter using the forms as templates, a creation myth that became enormously influential on both scientific thinking and Christian theology in the medieval period. The Philebus examines pleasure and knowledge as candidates for the good life, reaching a nuanced conclusion that neither alone is sufficient. The Laws, Plato's last and longest work, is a practical treatise on legislation for a second-best city, one that cannot have philosopher-kings but can be ordered by good laws toward good ends. Reading the late dialogues, you get the sense of a mind still actively working, still revising, still finding new difficulties in old solutions and new possibilities in abandoned directions. Plato at 80 was not resting on the achievements of his middle period. He was still philosophizing. Mathematics, the good, and what Plato thought was ultimately real. At the center of Plato's philosophical vision, connecting the theory of forms to the practical concerns of the examined life, is a conviction about the nature of mathematical reality and its relationship to the good. Mathematics, for Plato, was not merely a useful tool or a fascinating intellectual game. It was the clearest window we have on the nature of genuine reality. Mathematical truths are universal. The Pythagorean theorem applies to every right triangle in every possible world, not just the right triangles we happen to have examined. They are necessary. They could not be otherwise, not merely as a matter of how the world happens to be arranged, but as a matter of what is possible. They are eternal. They were true before anyone discovered them and will be true after everyone who knows them is dead. And they are independent of physical instantiation. Perfect circles do not exist in the physical world, where everything is only approximately circular, but the mathematical properties of the perfect circle are perfectly and permanently real. These features, universality, necessity, eternality, independence from physical reality, are exactly the features Plato attributes to the forms. Mathematics is the domain where the forms are most clearly and most rigorously accessible, where the transition from the visible to the intelligible is most complete. This is why the mathematical curriculum was so important in the education of the philosopher-rulers. It trained the mind in the habits of thought that genuine philosophy required. Aristotle reports that in his oral teaching at the Academy, Plato's later thought moved toward an even closer identification of forms with numbers, toward a mathematical metaphysics in which all of reality was ultimately derived from two primary principles, the one and the indefinite dyad. This technical system, which Plato apparently never wrote down in the dialogues, represents the most abstract and most mathematical version of the Platonic project. The world on this picture is fundamentally mathematical in its structure, and to understand the world at the deepest level is to understand the mathematical principles from which it flows. The form of the good, which sits at the summit of Plato's metaphysical hierarchy, is described in the Republic with deliberate and significant mystery. It is, Socrates says, beyond being, the source of the being and the knowability of all the other forms, related to the intelligible realm as the sun is to the visible realm, the ultimate source of both the existence and the visibility of everything else. But he declines to say what the good actually is, offering only the allegories of the sun and the cave and the divided line, and saying that a full account would require a much longer discussion that they do not have time for. This deliberate withholding suggests that Plato recognized he was approaching a limit of what could be said in philosophical prose, a point where image and allegory were more honest than propositions, because propositions would claim more precision than was warranted. The legacy, 2,500 years of footnotes. Alfred North Whitehead wrote in the 20th century that the safest general characterization of European philosophy is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This is an overstatement that Whitehead himself knew was an overstatement, but it captures something real. Plato's questions and Plato's frameworks have organized philosophical inquiry in the West in ways so deep and so pervasive that they are often invisible, mistaken for the natural structure of thought itself. The most immediate and most significant response to Plato was Aristotle, who studied at the academy for 20 years and whose philosophical system was developed partly in dialogue with and partly in opposition to what he had learned there. Aristotle rejected the theory of forms as Plato stated it, brought the universal down from a separate realm into the particular things themselves, and built a philosophical system centered on empirical inquiry and immanent form rather than transcendent form. But he worked within the framework of questions that Plato had established: the nature of substance and universals, the structure of knowledge and explanation, the relationship between the ideal and the actual, the nature of the good life and the good city. Neoplatonism, the philosophical and religious tradition that flourished from the 3rd through the 6th centuries of the Common Era, took Plato's thought in a more explicitly mystical direction. Plotinus, its greatest representative, developed an elaborate metaphysics of emanation from the utterly simple one, through intellect, down to soul and the material world, drawing heavily on Platonic texts while combining them with other influences. The ascent to the One was not merely a philosophical exercise, but a spiritual practice, a journey of the soul back toward its divine origin. Neoplatonism's influence on early Christianity was profound. Augustine found in Neoplatonism the philosophical framework that made it possible for him to understand Christian doctrine intellectually, and the Platonized Christianity that resulted shaped Western theology for more than 1,000 years. The Renaissance rediscovery of Plato, through Marsilio Ficino's complete translation of the dialogues into Latin in Florence under Medici patronage, produced a philosophical and cultural revival that gave the Renaissance much of its idealism, its conviction that beauty pointed toward a higher reality, its sense that the human mind had access to truths beyond what the senses could reveal. Botticelli's Primavera, Raphael's School of Athens with Plato pointing upward, Michelangelo's Neoplatonic sculptures of figures struggling to emerge from marble as souls struggle to emerge from matter. The visual art of the Renaissance is full of Platonic ideas given sensory form, which is exactly the kind of productive paradox that Plato's relationship with art always generated. In contemporary philosophy, Platonic positions remain live options in several domains. Mathematical Platonism, the view that mathematical objects exist independently of physical reality and human minds, that the truths of mathematics are discovered rather than invented, is held by a significant portion of working mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics. The dispute between realism and anti-realism about abstract objects is essentially a dispute about whether Plato was right about a specific and important domain of reality. In ethics, The conviction that moral truths are objective rather than subjective, that some things are genuinely right or wrong independently of what anyone thinks or feels about them, is a broadly Platonic position, though the particular metaphysical framework in which to ground it remains contested. Sitting with Plato in the dark. It is late now. Somewhere in the timeless space where dialogue exists as a form, Socrates is still asking Euthyphro what piety is, and Euthyphro is still trying to answer, and the answer is still not quite right, and the questioning continues. This is how Plato designed it. The dialogues do not end in conclusions, but in continuation, in the invitation to keep thinking, to keep asking, to keep following the argument wherever it leads. What I find most moving about Plato, and I want to end here, is his conviction that the most important things are real. Not merely useful fictions, not comforting illusions, not social constructions that serve various political purposes, but genuinely, independently, permanently real. The form of beauty is more real than any beautiful thing you have ever seen or will ever see. The form of justice is more real than any just act. The form of the good is more real than anything else in existence, the ultimate reality by which everything else is what it is, and is what it can be known to be. You can disagree with this. Most contemporary philosophers do, in various ways and to various degrees. But there is something in the conviction worth taking seriously. The idea that when we pursue truth and beauty and justice, we are not merely expressing preferences or following cultural conventions or serving biological imperatives, but reaching toward something that is actually there, actually worth reaching toward, actually better than the alternatives. Plato's philosophy is, at its core, an argument that the most important things are not arbitrary. He arrived at this conviction through the encounter with Socrates, through the experience of a man who cared more about truth than about his own life, and who made caring about truth seem like the most natural and necessary thing in the world. Plato spent 80 years trying to understand what that meant, trying to build a philosophical framework adequate to the example he had seen, trying to show that the commitment Socrates had demonstrated was not merely personal heroism, but philosophical necessity. He did not fully succeed. No single human project could. But what he built in the attempt is what 2,500 years of subsequent thinking has been working with, arguing against, being inspired by, and trying to move beyond. Outside the academy, in the grove of olive trees where Plato walked and taught and thought for decades, some of those trees are still standing. They were old when he walked among them. He thought about eternity in their shade, trying to understand what was real and what was passing, what the forms were, and how the soul could reach them, and what would be left when everything passing had passed. The trees are still there. The question is still open. It always will be. Sleep well. Thank you for thinking with me tonight.